The white dress had become a beacon in the desert heat, calling to something she never expected. Margaret stood frozen at the chapel steps, her veil catching the merciless Arizona wind when the shadow fell across her path. This wasn't the gentle hand of her intended groom reaching for hers. This was something that would change everything she thought she knew about fear, about giving, about the space between two beating hearts. The Apache warrior's eyes held a thirst deeper than the endless desert, and in that moment her carefully planned future crumbled like ancient stone. What happened next would haunt every woman in Tombstone for generations, but it would also teach them something about the courage that lives in the space between terror and grace. Subscribe to discover how one act of unexpected kindness can transform everything you believe about love and survival. The morning sun painted Margaret's wedding dress the color of bleached bones against the red earth of Arizona territory. She had sewn every pearl by hand through the long winter nights, dreaming of Thomas's gentle smile as he lifted her veil. The chapel bells should have been ringing by now, calling the scattered ranchers and their wives to witness her transformation from spinster schoolteacher to respectable wife. Instead, an unnatural silence hung over the settlement like a held breath, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Her mother's cameo trembled at her throat as she adjusted the ivory silk one final time, unaware that this dress, this symbol of her civilized hopes, would soon become something else entirely. The desert wind whispered secrets she couldn't yet understand, carrying scents of sage and something wilder, something that made her pulse quicken with an emotion she couldn't name. Margaret stepped onto the chapel porch, her satin slippers silent against the weathered wood, and felt the weight of watching eyes from every window in town. The women of Tombstone had gathered early, their faces pressed against glass panes, hungry for the spectacle of romance in a place where tenderness was as rare as rain. She could see Mrs. Henderson clutching her rosary and young Sarah Miller practically bouncing with excitement behind the mercantile counter. Thomas should have been waiting at the altar by now, his Sunday suit pressed and his hair slicked back with pomade, but the chapel doors remained closed like a secret the morning refused to tell. Her bouquet of desert wildflowers trembled in her gloved hands, their purple and gold petals already wilting in the heat that promised to be merciless before noon. Something was wrong. She could feel it in the way the horses stamped restlessly at their hitching posts, in the way even the dogs had fallen silent. The shadow fell across her path like a prophecy she had never learned to read. Margaret looked up from her bouquet to find herself face to face with a figure that seemed to have materialized from the desert itself. Tall, broad-shouldered, his skin bronzed by countless suns, and his long black hair adorned with feathers that caught the light like dark flames. He was Apache, she knew instantly, though she had never seen one this close, never looked directly into eyes that held the depth of canyons and the patience of stone. Her breath caught in her throat, not from fear, though fear was there, sharp and bright, but from something else, something that felt like recognition of a truth she had always known, but never spoken. The warrior's presence seemed to fill the entire morning, making her wedding dress feel suddenly fragile, like spider silk in a windstorm. Time stretched between them like a taut rope, and in that suspended moment, Margaret understood that her life was about to split into before and after. His lips moved, forming words in English that carried the rhythm of his native tongue, and the sound was like water over stones, like wind through canyon walls. "Water," he said, and the single word contained multitudes, exhaustion, dignity, a request that was also somehow a test. Margaret's eyes traveled to the canteen hanging from her waist, the one Thomas had insisted she carry for the journey to their new homestead after the ceremony. It was full, heavy with the precious liquid that meant survival in this unforgiving land, and she had been saving it for their wedding toast, for the moment when they would share their first drink as husband and wife. But looking into the Apache warrior's face, seeing the way the desert had carved lines of endurance around his eyes, She felt something shift inside her chest, like a door opening in a house she had never known she lived in. The canteen suddenly felt like the most important thing she had ever carried, more significant than her wedding ring, more vital than her carefully planned future. Without hesitation, without thought for what the watching townspeople might say, or what Thomas might think when he finally arrived, Margaret's hands moved to unfasten the canteen from her belt. The metal was warm from the sun and her body's heat, and as she lifted it toward the warrior, she felt as though she were offering more than water. She was offering a piece of her soul, a fragment of trust that she hadn't known she possessed. The Apache's eyes widened slightly, and she caught a glimpse of surprise there, as if he had expected refusal, expected the fear that would have been natural, expected anything but this quiet act of grace from a woman in a wedding dress. Her gloved fingers brushed his calloused ones as he accepted the canteen, and the contact sent a shock through her system like lightning touching earth. In that touch, she felt the vast loneliness of the desert, the weight of being misunderstood, the ache of a people pushed to the margins of a world that had once been entirely theirs. The warrior lifted the canteen to his lips and drank deeply, his throat working as the water flowed into him like life itself. Margaret watched, transfixed as drops escaped the corners of his mouth and traced silver paths down his chin, and she felt a strange pride in being able to offer this gift, this moment of relief in what she sensed had been a long and difficult journey. When he lowered the canteen, their eyes met again, and she saw something there that made her heart race. Gratitude, yes, but also a kind of recognition, as if he too felt the significance of this exchange that went far beyond the simple sharing of water. He spoke again, words in Apache that she couldn't understand, but that sounded like a blessing, like a prayer offered to the morning sky. Then he handed the empty canteen back to her, and Margaret realized that in giving him everything, she had somehow received something infinitely more valuable than what she had lost. The empty canteen felt heavier in Margaret's hands than it had when full, weighted with the significance of what had just passed between them. The Apache warrior stood before her for another heartbeat, his presence filling the space between the chapel and the desert like a bridge between two worlds she had never imagined could touch. Then, as silently as he had appeared, he turned and walked away, his moccasined feet making no sound on the hard-packed earth, his figure growing smaller against the vast backdrop of red rock and endless sky. Margaret remained frozen on the chapel steps, her wedding dress brilliant white against the weathered wood, watching until he disappeared into the heat shimmer that danced above the desert floor. The morning felt different now, charged with an electricity that made her skin tingle and her breath come shallow, as if the very air had been transformed by their encounter. Behind her, she could hear the chapel doors finally opening, the sound of boots on wooden floors, and Thomas's familiar voice calling her name with a note of confusion that cut through the desert silence. "Margaret, what are you doing out here? The ceremony should have started 10 minutes ago." She turned slowly, as if moving through water, to see her intended groom standing in the doorway, his face flushed from hurrying, his Sunday suit slightly rumpled from whatever had delayed him. Thomas was a good man, kind, reliable, the sort of husband any sensible woman would be grateful to marry. But looking at him now, Margaret felt as though she was seeing him through glass, as if the encounter with the Apache had placed a transparent barrier between her old life and this moment. His eyes fell to the empty canteen in her hands, and his brow furrowed with the beginning of questions she wasn't sure she could answer. "I gave it to someone who needed it," she said simply, her voice sounding strange to her own ears, distant and dreamlike. Thomas stepped closer, his concern evident in the way his hands reached for hers, and she could smell his familiar scent of soap and bay rum, comforting and safe and suddenly insufficient. "Gave what to whom, darling? You look pale. Are you feeling well? Perhaps we should postpone the ceremony until this afternoon when it's cooler." His words were reasonable, practical, everything she had always appreciated about him, but they seemed to come from very far away, as if he were speaking to her across a vast canyon. Margaret looked down at their joined hands, his pale and soft from working with ledgers and documents, hers still trembling slightly from the warrior's touch, and felt a sadness she couldn't name settling over her like dust after a windstorm. The townspeople had begun to emerge from their hiding places, drawn by curiosity and the need to understand what had transpired in their carefully ordered world. Mrs. Henderson approached with her usual bustling authority, her face tight with disapproval and barely contained questions. "Margaret, dear, we saw you speaking with that savage. Are you quite all right? Did he threaten you? Should we send for the sheriff?" The word savage hit Margaret like a physical blow, and she found herself stepping back from the circle of concerned faces, her hand instinctively protecting the empty canteen as if it were something precious. She wanted to tell them that he hadn't been savage at all, that his request had been made with more dignity than she had ever seen in their Sunday services, that his eyes had held depths of wisdom and sorrow that made their small concerns seem petty and meaningless. But the words stuck in her throat like thorns, and she could only shake her head, unable to bridge the gap between what she had experienced and what they would be able to understand. "He asked for water," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, and the simple statement fell into the gathering crowd like a stone into still water, creating ripples of confusion and disbelief. "Water," Thomas repeated, his voice rising with incredulity. "You gave our wedding water to an Apache warrior. Margaret, do you understand how dangerous that was? How it might be interpreted? What if others come looking for you now, thinking you're sympathetic to their cause?" His words carried the weight of genuine fear, and Margaret could see in his eyes the same terror that lived in all the settlers' hearts. The fear of the unknown, of the other, of anything that challenged their fragile sense of security in this harsh land. But she could also see something else there, something that made her heart sink, disappointment, as if she had failed some test of proper behavior that she hadn't even known she was taking. The sun climbed higher, beating down on the assembled crowd with increasing intensity, and Margaret felt sweat beginning to gather beneath her heavy wedding dress, making the fabric cling uncomfortably to her skin. The morning that had begun with such promise, with dreams of new beginnings and shared futures, had transformed into something she couldn't have imagined, a moment of reckoning that seemed to demand she choose between the life she had planned and something else entirely. Something she couldn't even name, but that called to her like a voice in the wilderness. She looked around at the faces surrounding her. Thomas with his wounded confusion, Mrs. Henderson with her righteous indignation, the other townspeople with their mixture of fear and fascination, and realized that none of them had seen what she had seen in the Apache warrior's eyes. None of them had felt the profound humanity in his simple request, the dignity in his acceptance of her gift, the blessing in his words of gratitude. They saw only threat where she had found grace, and in that moment, Margaret understood that she was more alone than she had ever been, even surrounded by everyone she had thought she knew. The days that followed moved like thick honey through Margaret's fingers, each hour stretching longer than the last as the town's judgment settled around her like dust after a storm. She found herself walking different paths to avoid the clusters of women who would fall silent when she approached, their eyes following her with a mixture of pity and suspicion that made her skin crawl. The general store became a battlefield of sideways glances, where Mrs. Henderson would count her change twice, as if Margaret might steal from her, and young mothers would pull their children closer when she passed. Even the church bells seemed to ring with accusation, their bronze voices calling the faithful to worship, while she sat alone in her kitchen, watching the coffee grow cold in her cup. The wedding dress still hung in her wardrobe like a ghost, its white silk now seeming to mock her with promises that would never be fulfilled. She had given water to a stranger, and somehow that simple act had marked her as dangerous, as other, as someone who could no longer be trusted to know the difference between civilization and wildness. The Apache's face haunted her dreams, not with terror, but with a strange peace that she couldn't understand or explain to anyone who asked. His eyes had held depths that reminded her of the old well behind her father's house, dark and cool and infinitely deep, reflecting back not fear, but recognition of something she hadn't known she possessed. When she closed her eyes, she could still feel the weight of the canteen leaving her hands, the moment when everything she thought she knew about herself shifted like sand beneath her feet. The townspeople spoke of her foolishness and reckless endangerment, but Margaret knew they were wrong about what had happened in that dusty street. She had not been foolish. She had been awake for the first time in years, responding to something truer than all the careful rules that governed their small world. The memory of his gratitude burned in her chest like an ember that refused to die, warming her even as the town's coldness tried to freeze her out. In giving him water, she had discovered a thirst in herself that no amount of their approval could ever quench. Thomas had not spoken to her since that day, his silence more devastating than any angry words could have been. She would see him across the street, his shoulders rigid with disappointment, his eyes sliding past her as if she had become invisible. The other men followed his lead, tipping their hats with mechanical politeness but keeping their distance, as if her act of kindness had infected her with something contagious. Margaret found herself remembering the way Thomas used to look at her, with admiration and possession intertwined, and realized now that his love had always been conditional on her remaining safely predictable. He had wanted a wife who would pour his coffee and bear his children and never surprise him with depths he couldn't fathom or control. The Apache had asked for nothing but water, and in that simple request had shown her more respect than Thomas ever had. She began to understand that her broken engagement was not a loss, but a liberation, though the knowledge came wrapped in loneliness so sharp it took her breath away. The man she had almost married had never really seen her at all, only the reflection of what he wanted her to be. Her mother's letters arrived like clockwork, each one a masterpiece of disappointed expectation wrapped in maternal concern. "What will people think?" became the refrain that echoed through every carefully penned line, as if the opinions of strangers were more important than Margaret's own heart. The letters spoke of reputation and propriety, of the shame that would follow their family name, of the difficulty of finding another suitable husband after such a scandal. Margaret would read them by lamplight, feeling the weight of generations of women who had chosen safety over truth, comfort over courage. Her mother had married for security and spent 40 years in a house that felt more like a prison, and now she wanted the same careful cage for her daughter. But Margaret had tasted something different in that moment of giving, had felt the expansion of her own spirit when she chose compassion over caution. The letters went unanswered, piling up on her kitchen table like autumn leaves, beautiful and brittle, and ultimately meaningless. She could not explain to her mother that she had found herself in the act of losing everything they thought mattered. The nights were the hardest, when the silence of her small house pressed against her like a living thing. Margaret would sit by her window, looking out at the vast darkness beyond the town's edges, wondering about the Apache and where his journey had taken him. She imagined him riding through moonlit canyons, carrying her water in his belly like a blessing, and the thought brought her a peace that nothing else could touch. The stars seemed brighter now, as if her act of kindness had somehow cleared the air between earth and heaven, and she found herself praying not for forgiveness, but for understanding. The God she spoke to in those quiet hours was not the stern judge of Sunday sermons, but something wilder and more generous, something that might smile upon a woman who chose love over fear. Her prayers became conversations with the darkness, confessions of a loneliness that was somehow less bitter than the false companionship she had known before. In losing her place in their small world, she had found a connection to something infinitely larger. The town's memory was long and unforgiving, but Margaret discovered that her own was longer still. She remembered the feeling of the canteen's weight, the trust in the Apache's eyes, the moment when she had chosen to see him as human rather than threat. That memory became her anchor in the storm of their disapproval, the one true thing in a world that suddenly seemed built on lies and fear. She began to understand that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act in spite of it, and that kindness was not weakness, but the strongest force she had ever wielded. The water she had given away had somehow multiplied, becoming a river of possibility that flowed through her dreams and waking hours alike. She had lost a fiancé, a community, a future she had thought she wanted, but in return she had found herself. And that seemed like the better bargain after all. 3 weeks after the encounter, Margaret made a decision that surprised even herself. She would leave Millbrook not in shame, but in search of something she couldn't name, but knew she needed to find. The house that had sheltered her for 23 years suddenly felt too small to contain the person she was becoming, its familiar walls pressing against her like a dress that no longer fit. She began to pack her belongings with the methodical care of someone preparing for a journey into unknown territory, folding her clothes around the memory of the Apache's grateful nod. The wedding dress she left hanging in the wardrobe, a white flag of surrender to a life she would never live. Her hands moved with purpose as she sorted through the accumulation of years, keeping only what felt essential for the woman she was becoming. The mirror in her bedroom reflected back a face she was still learning to recognize, marked not by shame, but by a quiet determination that made her eyes seem deeper, more alive. She was no longer the bride who had waited for rescue. She was becoming someone who could rescue herself. The decision to head west came to her like a whisper from the desert wind that sometimes reached their town on the hottest days. She had heard stories of women who had made lives for themselves in the territories, teachers and shopkeepers, and even ranchers who had carved out spaces where they could breathe freely. The idea terrified and thrilled her in equal measure, this notion of stepping beyond the boundaries that had always defined her world. Margaret sold her mother's china and her grandmother's jewelry, keeping only a simple silver locket that had belonged to her father's sister, a woman who had died young but had lived, according to family legend, exactly as she pleased. The money would buy her passage on the westbound stage and enough supplies to start over somewhere no one knew her story or cared about her past. She wrote letters to her mother and Thomas, explanations that felt inadequate but necessary, words that tried to capture the magnitude of her transformation. The woman who sealed those envelopes was not the same one who had awakened on her wedding morning, and she was grateful for the difference. The morning she left Millbrook dawned clear and bright, the sky stretching endlessly blue above the dusty main street. Margaret stood at the stage depot with her single carpet bag and a heart that hammered against her ribs like a caged bird finally seeing an open door. The other passengers eyed her with curiosity. A woman traveling alone was unusual enough to warrant attention, but she met their gazes with a steadiness that surprised them all. The stage driver, a weathered man named Jake, who had seen every kind of human drama play out in his coach, helped her up with a gentleness that spoke of understanding. As the horses began to move and the town fell away behind them, Margaret felt something inside her chest expand, like a flower opening to sunlight. The familiar landmarks of her childhood blurred past the window, becoming memory even as she watched, and she realized she was not running away, but running towards something she had always been meant to find. The dust cloud that rose behind the stage was not just dirt, but the remnants of a life too small for the woman she had become. The journey west was a revelation of landscape and spirit, each mile carrying her further from the person she had been and closer to the person she was becoming. The other passengers, a merchant heading to Santa Fe, a young couple seeking their fortune in California, an elderly woman visiting her son, gradually warmed to her quiet presence, drawn by something in her manner that spoke of depth and resilience. Margaret found herself listening to their stories with an attention that seemed to surprise them, offering comfort and wisdom that came from some well within herself she hadn't known existed. The merchant spoke of his fear of Apache raids, and Margaret found herself defending the humanity of people he had never met, her voice carrying a conviction that silenced his protests. The young wife confided her terror of the unknown territory ahead, and Margaret shared her own fears with an honesty that created an instant bond between them. In the cramped confines of the stagecoach, she discovered that her capacity for compassion had not been diminished by the town's rejection, but had grown stronger, like a muscle exercised by resistance. The desert landscape that unfolded beyond the coach windows spoke to something primal in Margaret's soul, its vast emptiness somehow feeling more like home than the crowded familiarity of Millbrook ever had. The red rocks and endless sky seemed to echo the expansion she felt within herself, the sense that she was finally in a place large enough to contain all that she was becoming. At night, when they camped beneath stars that seemed close enough to touch, she would lie awake, listening to the coyotes sing and feeling a kinship with their wild voices. The other passengers huddled close to the fire, nervous about the darkness beyond its circle of light, but Margaret found peace in the vast unknown that surrounded them. She thought often of the Apache who had asked for water, wondering if he had traveled these same paths, if his feet had touched this same red earth. The memory of their encounter had become a talisman she carried, proof that kindness could bridge any divide, that understanding could flourish even in the briefest of meetings. The desert was teaching her that emptiness was not absence but possibility, that in the space between what was and what could be, miracles were born. As they approached the territorial town of Esperanza, Margaret felt a stirring of anticipation that had nothing to do with arrival and everything to do with beginning. The name itself seemed like a promise, hope in Spanish, a language she was determined to learn, a culture she wanted to understand. The town appeared on the horizon like a mirage made real, its adobe buildings glowing golden in the afternoon sun, its streets wide enough for dreams to take root and grow. Margaret pressed her face to the coach window, drinking in the sight of a place where her story was not yet written, where she could be anyone she chose to become. The other passengers spoke of their plans and destinations, but Margaret's future felt beautifully uncertain, a blank page waiting for her to fill it with whatever words felt true. She was no longer the woman who had given water to a stranger. She was the woman that act of giving had revealed her to be, and that woman was ready for whatever came next. Esperanza welcomed Margaret with the casual acceptance of a town accustomed to strangers seeking new beginnings. The boarding house where she took a room was run by a Mexican woman named Esperanza Morales, whose name matched the town's and whose weathered hands spoke of a lifetime spent nurturing others. Senora Morales asked no questions about Margaret's past, seeming to understand instinctively that some stories were better left untold until their tellers were ready to share them. The room was simple but clean, with a window that looked out over the plaza where children played and vendors sold their wares, their voices creating a music Margaret had never heard in Millbrook's careful quiet. She unpacked her few belongings with the reverence of someone setting up a shrine, each item carefully placed as if to anchor her new life in this foreign soil. The silver locket went on the small table beside her bed, catching the desert light and throwing it back in patterns that danced across the adobe walls. For the first time since her wedding day, Margaret felt the possibility of happiness settling around her like a comfortable shawl. Within a week, she had found work at the town's small school, teaching the children of miners and ranchers and shopkeepers who saw education as a luxury they could barely afford but desperately wanted for their young ones. The schoolhouse was a single room with rough wooden benches and a blackboard that had seen better days, but to Margaret it felt like a cathedral of possibility. Her students were a mixture of Mexican and Anglo children, some speaking only Spanish, others only English, all of them hungry for the knowledge she could offer. She found herself learning as much as she taught, picking up Spanish words and phrases that felt like music on her tongue, discovering that kindness needed no translation. The children responded to her gentle authority with an eagerness that reminded her why she had always loved learning, why books had been her refuge in a world that often felt too small. In teaching them, she was teaching herself that wisdom could flow in both directions, that the act of giving always returned more than it cost. The memory of the Apache who had asked for water became a touchstone for how she approached her new life, a reminder that every encounter held the potential for grace. When young Miguel struggled with his letters, she remembered the patience in the Apache's eyes and found reserves of gentleness she hadn't known she possessed. When little Sarah cried because the other children teased her for her ragged clothes, Margaret thought of the dignity with which the Apache had made his request and taught the child to hold her head high despite their cruelty. The lessons she had learned in that dusty street in Millbrook became the foundation for everything she built in Esperanza, each act of compassion a stone in the bridge she was constructing between who she had been and who she was becoming. The townspeople began to speak of the new teacher with respect and affection, noting how she seemed to see the best in every child, how she never gave up on even the most difficult students. She was discovering that the water she had given away had somehow multiplied, becoming an endless spring of empathy that nourished everyone it touched. 3 months into her new life, Margaret was walking home from school when she saw a familiar figure watering his horse at the town well. Her heart stopped, then began to race as she recognized the Apache who had changed her life with a simple request. He looked up as she approached, and his face broke into a smile of recognition that seemed to light up the entire plaza. They stood there for a moment, two people whose lives had intersected in the briefest of encounters, but who had carried each other forward in ways neither could have imagined. He spoke to her in careful English, thanking her again for her kindness, telling her that her water had sustained him through a difficult journey to visit his sick mother. Margaret found herself crying, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming rightness of this moment, the sense that some circle was being completed in ways she couldn't fully understand. The water she had given had traveled hundreds of miles and returned to her transformed, carrying with it the proof that kindness was never wasted, that compassion always found its way home. As they talked, Margaret learned that his name was Joseph, that he worked as a translator and guide for the territorial government, that he had been educated at a mission school and spoke 4 languages fluently. He told her about his people's struggles and hopes, about the delicate balance between tradition and survival in a world that was changing faster than anyone could adapt. She shared her own story of transformation, how his simple request had awakened something in her that had led her to this new life, this new understanding of herself. They talked until the sun began to set, painting the adobe buildings in shades of gold and rose, and Margaret realized that she was no longer the frightened woman who had fled Millbrook in search of something she couldn't name. She had found it here, in this conversation, in this connection that transcended all the boundaries her old world had tried to impose. The woman who had given water to a stranger had become someone who could receive the gift of understanding in return, and that exchange felt like the most natural thing in the world. When Joseph finally mounted his horse to continue his journey, he turned back to her with a smile that held all the warmth of the desert sun. "You gave me water when I was thirsty," he said, his voice carrying the weight of ceremony. "Now I give you something in return, the knowledge that your kindness has traveled far and touched many lives. The story of the woman who saw a human being instead of a threat has been told around many fires, and it has made the world a little safer for all of us. Margaret watched him ride away into the gathering dusk, his figure becoming one with the vast landscape that had taught her so much about the beauty of emptiness and the power of space. She stood there long after he disappeared, feeling the weight of his words settling into her bones like a blessing. The water she had given had become a river, flowing through countless lives and carrying with it the promise that compassion could indeed change the world, one small act of courage at a time.